Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Okay guys, so before we begin today's video, I do have two announcements I need to make. In case you don't know, yesterday we passed another huge milestone on this channel and passed the 70,000 subscriber mark. And guys, seriously, I really just, words can't express the gratitude I feel to each and every single one of you. When I started doing YouTube a year and a half ago, I never dreamed I would get to this point. So just, if it wasn't for all of you, I definitely wouldn't be here. So guys, just thank you. Thank you so much. And then my second announcement. So in this video, we are going to continue the Heroes of the Titanic series. And I know I did say that I was only going to do 3 Heroes of the Titanic and then I was going to wrap up this series. However, all of you seem to like this series so much that I decided that I'm going to keep this series as a video series that I will do every now and again. So basically what this means is I'm still going to do all the other video topics on my channel, but I thought it would be fun to every now and again do another Hero of the Titanic episode. You know, talk about maybe Joseph Bell or Captain Smith or Murdoch or something, and just every time I tell a story of one of these guys, I'll call it Heroes of the Titanic, and then I will have the name of whoever we're going to be talking about in this video. What do you guys think of this idea? Let me know what you think in the comments below. All right, everybody, with those announcements out of the way, let's now continue the Heroes of the Titanic series. And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the Titanic's Marconi radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride.
Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were the 2 Marconi wireless operators on board the RMS Titanic. And in case you don't know what a Marconi wireless is, basically at the time of Titanic, it was the Titanic's radio. It was how the Titanic communicated with the outside world. However, it's important to note that a Marconi wireless system could not transmit voice. Basically, the only thing it could do was transmit the dots and dashes of Morse code. What Jack Phillips and Harold Bride did was they used something called a Morse key. And then, using this Morse key, they transmitted the dots and dashes of Morse code, allowing the Titanic to communicate with all other ships on the sea.
Now, it's important to note that at the time of Titanic, the whole idea of having a Marconi wireless system on board a ship was still a relatively new concept. You see, the Marconi wireless system had only started to be implemented on ships within the past 10 years or so leading up to the Titanic disaster. So, as I said, it was still a relatively new concept. And before the Marconi wireless system came out, the only way that ships could communicate with each other was by line-of-sight communication methods. So they'd use things like signal flags or signal flares or whatever to communicate with each other. But the biggest problem with this system of communication was that if you didn't have line of sight on whatever you were talking to, you couldn't talk to it. Which means if you couldn't see a ship, you couldn't talk to a ship. But all of that changed thanks to the Marconi wireless system. With this new wireless system, you could now talk to ships that were hundreds of miles away. I mean, just think about how much of an influence this made on the entire transatlantic shipping industry. Now, the range of the wireless system did fluctuate a little bit depending on what time of day or night you were using it. So during the daytime, the Marconi wireless system could transmit roughly 300 miles or so, give or take. And then at nighttime, sometimes the range was double that. There are instances of where the Marconi wireless system could transmit a signal to locations up to 600 miles away during the evenings. And the reason this was possible was due to changes in the atmospheric conditions of Earth that shifted between daytime and nighttime. However, it seems like that usually during the nighttime, the Marconi wireless system could transmit roughly 400 miles or so. It would take very, very good atmospheric conditions for it to be able to transmit up to 600 miles away.
Alright, so now that you understand why the Marconi wireless system was such a revolutionary new tool to be used on ships, let's now talk about what type of information ships like the Titanic would share with other ships and land stations while they were sailing across the Atlantic. Well, to put it simply, they would share with other ships official news about their vessel, you know? They would let other ships know what the position of their ship was, they would let other ships know what the weather was, they would let other ships know what type of hazards they encountered while sailing the Atlantic, like icebergs, for example. But probably the most crucial use for the new radio system, or Marconi wireless system, was that This new radio allowed ships to transmit a distress call to other ships should an emergency situation come up on board a particular vessel. This radio system was a huge help with a ship called the RMS Republic, which sank in the year 1909. And fun fact, this ship was the very first ship to ever transmit a distress call via the Marconi wireless system. Now, jumping back to the Titanic for a second, the Marconi wireless system also had another use that wasn't for official purposes. This use was to be used by the Titanic's passengers. You see, this radio system allowed the Titanic's passengers to be able to send messages to their loved ones back home. Can you imagine how cool of a concept this must have been to all the passengers on board the Titanic? You know, now that they got this brand new radio system, they could share with all their family members back home how the voyage was going. I'm sure this feature was greatly used by all the passengers on board the Titanic. And, of course, because all the passengers on board the ship wanted to make use of this feature, this meant that Jack Phillips and Harold Bride would have been very busy transmitting all of these messages while the Titanic was steaming across the Atlantic.
Alright, so now that all of you out there have a basic understanding into how the Marconi wireless system worked, and now that you all understand why having the system on board ships was such a big deal, let's now jump to the RMS Titanic and talk about the Titanic's two radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, and I'm going to share with you all their story so you all know why they are true heroes of the Titanic disaster. Now, just a quick disclaimer here, guys. I'm not going to be sharing with you the entire story of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, meaning I'm not going to be telling you everything that happened to them throughout the Titanic's maiden voyage. But more specifically, we're going to focus on their actions that contributed to saving as many lives as possible on the night that the Titanic went down. Alright guys, well hey, with that out of the way, let's now tell the story of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride.
It is late in the evening on April 13th, 1912 on board the RMS Titanic. While the Titanic is still steaming across the Atlantic, the Titanic's radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, are hard at work in the Titanic's radio room, aka the Marconi room, transmitting the personal messages of the Titanic's passengers to their loved ones back home. It is during this time that Jack Phillips noticed something odd with the Titanic's radio system. He noticed that the signal started to get weaker, began to cut out, and then the Titanic's radio abruptly stopped working and would not transmit any longer. So, upon realizing this, Jack Phillips stopped typing on the Titanic's Morse key and began to investigate the radio system to try to figure out what the problem was.
Now, when Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began trying to work on repairing the Titanic's radio system, it took a lot longer than what the two men initially thought. I couldn't find the exact time that the radio went offline, but I do know it was later in the evening on April 13th, 1912. So I'm just going to guess here. I'd say it went offline somewhere around maybe 6, 7, maybe 8 p.m., somewhere in that ballpark range. If you do know the exact time that the Titanic's radio went offline on April 13th, please let me know in the comments below. I would really like to see it. But anyway, regardless of what time the radio went offline, these two men worked long into the night to try to repair the Titanic's radio system. And they were able to bring the Marconi system back online somewhere around 4 a.m. on April 14th, 1912. So they worked basically all night and almost all the way to dawn the next day trying to fix the Titanic's broken radio system. But they were successful in doing it. They repaired the radio, hooked it back up, and the thing worked better than before. But here's the thing. Even though it was good that these two men were able to repair the Titanic's radio system, they weren't supposed to do that. You see, according to the Marconi manual, it said that in the event that your radio should go offline, don't touch it, wait for your ship to arrive in port, and then have a certified Marconi technician come in and repair the radio. Do not try to repair it yourself. But these two men were confident that they knew how to fix the radio, and they're like, you know what, let's try to fix it. And guess what? They did. Now, according to the Marconi manual, it stated that if the radio should go offline, you're supposed to switch over to the emergency backup set and then use that to send your messages. However, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride didn't want to do this because the range of the emergency set is extremely limited. Where the main system can transmit somewhere between 300 and 400 miles away from a ship, the emergency set can only transmit up to 50 miles away. So as you can see, this would severely limit Jack Phillips and Harold Bride's ability to do work on board the Titanic. And as you all know, this would also seriously limit how many ships would hear the Titanic's distress call when the sinking of the Titanic would begin. However, we're not quite at that point yet.
Now, because both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had spent so much time on that particular evening trying to fix the Titanic's busted radio system, the two men really didn't get all that much time to sleep on that particular evening. It was worse for Jack Phillips because he spent all of his time that he should have been sleeping trying to repair the Titanic's radio system. It was basically Harold Bride's shift when the two men were trying to fix the radio. Now, after the two men fixed the radio system, Jack Phillips did try to get a little bit of sleep. However, he wasn't able to sleep for very long before it was time for him to resume duty on the Titanic's radio system, continuing to transmit official and personal messages from the RMS Titanic.
Now, as April the 14th, 1912 came and went, the Titanic continued to steam across the Atlantic, and both Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were hard at work in the Marconi room, transmitting both official documents from the Titanic to other ships and land stations, as well as send personal messages from the Titanic's passengers to their loved ones back home. Also during this time period, the Titanic also received several official documents that needed to be delivered to the Titanic's bridge. This included several ice warnings. You see, there were a good number of ships in the area of Titanic that were letting the Titanic know that there was icebergs in the area and that they should proceed forward with caution.
Now, for the most part, the day of April the 14th, 1912 was a pretty uneventful day on board the Titanic. However, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were extremely busy on this day, trying to transmit every single message that they couldn't send from the night before due to the Titanic's radio being offline. The next major incident of note for Jack Phillips and Harold Bride occurred at 9:40 p.m. ship's time on board the Titanic. At this time, another vessel sent an ice warning to the Titanic. However, due to the fact that Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were so busy with sending personal messages from the Titanic's passengers, and due to the fact that they had already sent several ice warnings to the bridge, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride never relayed this ice warning to the bridge.
Now, as the evening of April the 14th, 1912 continued on, the Titanic entered wireless communication range of Cape Race located in Newfoundland. When this happened, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began to transmit some of the personal messages of some of the Titanic's passengers to Cape Race, and then once the messages were received there, Cape Race could relay them to where the messages needed to go. Now, Cape Race was roughly 400 miles or so away from the Titanic. And for me to properly explain the next incident that was about to happen, I need to explain another thing you had to deal with when you tried to transmit a message with a Marconi wireless system. You see, when you tried to send a signal long distance on a Marconi wireless system, the further away a location was, the louder you had to have your radio set in order to hear the faint dots and dashes of the location that you're trying to talk to. So because Cape Race was 400 miles or so away from Titanic, Jack Phillips had to have his radio turned up pretty loud to hear the faint dots and dashes of the Morse code coming from Cape Race. Now, another thing you have to remember is there weren't different frequencies at the time. Anybody with a radio system could turn on the radio and hear what ships were talking to whoever at that time period. Now, while Jack Phillips was talking to Cape Race, this is when the next incident occurred.
Then, at 11:07 p.m. Titanic time, another ship known as the SS Californian, which at this time period was roughly 20 miles or so away from the Titanic, tried to message the Titanic and let them know that they were surrounded by ice and decided to stop for the evening. Now, when the Californian tried to message the Titanic, Jack Phillips was currently trying to talk to Cape Race, and Jack Phillips had his radio turned up near maximum so he could hear Cape Race. So, when the Californian tried to message in, it came through as a very loud ring in his ear and caused Jack Phillips to rip off the headset.
Now, right after Jack Phillips received that very loud ring in his ear and ripped off his headset, he threw the headset onto the desk and then just kind of sat there for a moment contemplating what he was going to do next. And then the decision he made after this was a result of, number one, he was angry that he just got a very loud ring in his ear. And number two, he was also in a bad mood due to the fact that he had gotten next to no sleep over the last 24 hours. What Jack Phillips did next was he sent a very angry message to the Californian. He told the Californian to keep out, shut up. I am working Cape Race. Quit jamming. And then once he sent this to the Californian's radio operator received it, and the Californian's radio operator was like, wow, okay, I was just trying to help, but if you're going to be like that, whatever. Now, on the Californian, the radio operator on there was about to go to bed for the evening. So upon getting this really rude message from the Titanic, the Californian's radio operator shut down the radio on board that ship, and then he went to bed. Now, the Californian only had one radio operator. The Californian wasn't able to maintain a 24-hour radio watch like the Titanic was. So, once the Californian's radio operator went to bed, the Californian now had no way to communicate with any other ships on the Atlantic.
Then, at 11:39 p.m., roughly 30 minutes or so after the whole Californian incident occurred, on the Titanic's boat deck, an object was spotted out ahead of the Titanic. A strange shadow appeared out of the darkness and was heading straight towards the bow of the Titanic. And while everybody on the ship at this time didn't yet know it, this strange object that the Titanic was steaming directly towards would change the fate of everybody on board the ship forever.
Alright everybody, well hey, sorry, but I think this is where we're going to need to pause the story of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride for now. I really didn't want to make this video a multi-parter, but we're 15 minutes into this video, well really 16 minutes in, and we are just now getting to the iceberg impact. And guys, trust me, there is a lot of information about Jack Phillips and Harold Bride and their story following what happened to them after the Titanic hit the iceberg. So in order to do this story and do it right, I'm gonna have to make it a multi-parter. Alright guys, well hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure you leave this video a like, be sure to subscribe. Oh, and if you guys would like to watch that documentary that I showed clips of in this video of Jack Phillips and Harold Bride doing stuff on the Titanic, well that documentary is called The Last Signals, and I will include a link to that documentary in the description below, so feel free to go and watch that. Alright everybody, well hey, thank you all so much for watching, and stand by for part 2, and I will see you guys at the live stream on Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Y'all take care, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporters, Jeremy Hack, Jeffrey Clayton, Dakota Charbonneau, Moosh, and Greg Gallick. Thank you all so much for all the support.